Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight at ROM. Well, as we get all of our guests here tonight. My name is Jennifer Wild, and I'm the Deputy Director for Engagement here at ROM, and I'm delighted to join you tonight for our program. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that this museum sits on the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, from time immemorial to the present. I'm a descendant settler of European heritage, living on Turtle Island, and I'm also an immigrant citizen of the nation of Canada. Today, as we gather here today, I am reminded that this land has been a meeting and learning place for diverse Indigenous peoples for many generations, and I'm honored to have the opportunity tonight to be part of continuing that tradition. This evening's program explores the making of Landscape of Nations Beyond the Mist, and I have a copy of this spectacular new book right here. It's a beautiful book. It takes readers on a journey of learning and understanding through Niagara's profoundly compelling Indigenous heritage and legacy, drawing upon archaeological data, the meta-narratives of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe cultures, British Indian Department records, private correspondence, testimony, proclamations, memoirs, and photographs and belongings from museums, collections of numerous museums, libraries, and archives. The book, Landscape of Nations Beyond the Mist, illuminates how the things got to be the way they are through the oscillating relations between Canada and the original peoples and nations who helped secure its existence. Landscape of Nations Beyond the Mist will be available for sale after the program tonight, and I understand the authors here will be there to sign copies of the book that you purchase. We're also going to invite you for a small reception afterwards with refreshments provided by Dashmowan Bamanzinjin, which means they feed the people, a lovely catering group that we have been working with. And I want to give a special thank you to the Indigenous Learning and Programs and the engagement teams tonight at ROM for supporting tonight's event. And before we begin, just want to remind everyone to please silence your phones and any other devices. And now I would like to introduce my colleague, Tim Johnson, who's been an integral part of ROM exhibitions and the ongoing reimagining of the Daphne Cockwell First Peoples Gallery here at the museum, where he served as Senior Curatorial Advisor. Tim Johnson is now the Senior Advisor for Heritage and Legacy at the Niagara Parks Commission, Senior Advisor at Plenty Canada, Indigenous Advisor on Museums, Heritage, and Legacy for Lord Cultural Resources, and Executive Producer of the multiple award-winning documentary Rumble, The Indians Who Rocked the World. He holds board memberships with the Niagara Escarpment Biosphere Network, Niagara Peninsula Aspiring Geopark, Bruce Trail Conservancy, Niagara on the Lake Museum, McMichael Canadian Art Collection, and the Shaw Festival. So you can see we're very lucky to have a few hours of his tonight. Tim has also been instrumental in the development of several distinguished works of public art in the Niagara region. These consist of memorials of national significance that recognize and honor Indigenous peoples' contributions to Canada, including the Landscape of Nations Memorial. His recent exhibition, Miskoaki, Red Earth, Confluence of Cultures at the Muskoka Discovery Center, earned the 2024 Outstanding Achievement Award from the Canadian Museums Association and the 2024 Ontario Tourism Award of Excellence for Indigenous Tourism. He is the former Associate Director for Museum Programs at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. And Tim has just had a profound impact on museums across North America with his work. Tim will be your host for this evening's talk, and he will be joined by his co-editor, Rick Hill, and contributing authors, Josh Manitowabi, Jim Hill, Ron Williamson, Richard Merritt, Martin Cooper, Alex Heidvushel, and Travis Hill. Please welcome our guests on the stage tonight. Okay, Tim.
I guess that's my cue. That's your cue. Okay. All right. Well, I'm delighted to be here today at the Royal Ontario Museum to unveil and present to you the outcome of several years of work, the publication by the Niagara Parks Commission in association with Plenty Canada of the book Landscape of Nations Beyond the Mist. Now, Jennifer did a great job describing all of the components that came together to make this book possible, all of the research and the organizations that we had to partner with to get the information and rights and permissions for historic photographs, paintings, and so forth. For the Niagara region and beyond, I would say, including here in Toronto, and it's great to see the turnout here today in Toronto, this is a significant work. It is a profoundly important intellectual, historical, and educational product. There are many people to thank, beginning with the general editor of the book, Rick Hill. Rick was eager to support the concept, and collectively we pulled together the themes and range of content that we wanted to feature while recruiting those who could best deliver that content. And we've got some 17 authors total, and here's a good representation here with us tonight. Primary funders of this project have been the Niagara Parks Commission and the Clench House Foundation, which is supported by Andy and Valerie Pringle. Andy is currently the chair of the Board of Trustees of the McMichael Canadian Art Collection. In addition, Plenty Canada provided additional financial resources and significant in-kind support over the past 3 years. Now then, before we launch into an overview of the book, I want to highlight how we came to this point. For me, the book is the third part of an artistic and conceptual triptych that began with the establishment of the Landscape of Nations Commemorative Memorial in Queenston Heights Park. From my involvement in joining Rick and others resolving and helping to complete that work through to today, I've spent some 15 years on the initiative. And so that's the longest I've ever dedicated to a single project in my career. But I believe it underscores the project's strategic importance. And we do have to say that with the establishment of the Landscape of Nations Memorial, we've really transformed the entire Niagara region and the understanding by people in that area of the significant Indigenous history that has taken place there and the ongoing legacy of that history. So the triptych I mentioned consists of 3 components. The first was the design, fabrication, and installation of the Landscape of Nations Memorial in Queenston Heights Park. The second being the development of 10 essential understandings framework that provided themes and key concepts for learning about Niagara's Indigenous history. And a lot of that approach and strategy on that was developed at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, and we brought it over here to work on this particular project. And then the third piece, third component of the triptych was this book, and which puts the meat on the bones of those 10 essential understanding themes and key concepts. The real history now is embedded through all of the pages of this book. So we now have in place a comprehensive set of components useful to advancing place-based learning and elevating public understanding about the deep and profound legacy established by Indigenous peoples within Niagara. For Niagara Parks, the book represents a new foray into the establishment of a place-based learning platform predicated upon the insightful lessons embedded within multiple locations or destinations located within the park system. It's about highlighting and building history, heritage, and legacy elements into the park, much like the roads, bridges, and facilities that are resourced each and every year. The book also supports the concept of Niagara Parks being a living park. The concept of a living park builds on the idea of integrating ecological principles, sustainability practices, and community engagement to create dynamic and thriving public spaces. Unlike traditional parks that primarily focus on recreation and green spaces, living parks aim to enhance biodiversity, promote environmental education, and foster a deeper connection between people, their history, and nature. They aim to bring history to life through dynamic demonstrations, reenactments, and place-based learning activities. In this regard, the incredibly significant assets held by Niagara Parks place it in an enviable position to enhance its reputation and standing by integrating a place-based learning strategy within its institutional practices, applications, and public presence. Now, as someone who spent 11 and a half years with the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. and New York City, I find comparisons with Niagara Parks quite interesting, and it was part of the motivation for developing this book. Niagara Parks is founded upon a natural environment that extends some 56 kilometers along the length of the Niagara River, all the way from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. The Smithsonian extends but 3 kilometers from the Capitol steps to the Lincoln Memorial. Among Smithsonian museums on the National Mall, attendance was approximately 12 million visitors in 2023, while attendance or visitation to Niagara Parks was estimated up to somewhere between 12 and 14 million people. So just think about that in terms of potential. And while Smithsonian museums offer some intriguing views, they are mostly of buildings, while the beautiful vistas throughout Niagara Parks are a combination of natural and human-made wonders. And you will see that in the pages of the book. Now, we're only going to show you page spreads throughout the book. The book's 256 pages. You'll see a couple of spreads of each chapter, but not the entire book tonight. But you will see this visual history sort of come to life. Now, certainly Washington, D.C. is central to America's history and political evolution, but so too are the lands and historic sites within Niagara Parks in relation to Indigenous nations and to Canada's own nation-building history. And these are some of the lessons and ideas and information that you're going to get from this book. Really significant history took place along that Niagara River. So thank you all for being here. At this time, we'll launch into the presentation. I'll begin and then invite our general editor, Rick Hill, to then take us through the arc chapter by chapter through the book. And as he's doing that, he will call up various authors for each of those chapters, or folks who participated. And they'll come up and say a little bit as well about the work that they did for the book. So here's the cover. This is Santee Smith, by the way, who's an amazing Indigenous choreographer and dancer, and also Chancellor of McMaster University, a real phenomenal artist. And so we were able to capture this image for the cover of the book. Now, great public institutions publish books for several key reasons, and I've always been an advocate for publishing. We published a number of books at the Smithsonian while I was there. Rick was very active publishing as well during his time at the Smithsonian. So here's some of the key reasons why it's important for significant institutions, like the ROM. ROM publishes as well. It's very important. Dissemination of knowledge, preservation of research, educational mission, enhancing reputation, fostering collaboration and having public engagement. As I mentioned earlier, to be able to produce a book like this, we were working with dozens of other organizations, universities, research libraries, archives, all of these things to pull, and photographers, to pull this information together. Funding and support. some of these projects are great to bring funders into because having this record or this document that shows that they've really done something, and promoting institutional goals. So our authors have a significant track record in publishing. I think it's important to recognize this. Myself, when I was overseeing museum programs at the National Museum of the American Indian, I probably directed over a dozen books during my time there. Infinity of Nations, Art and History in the Collections of the National Museum of the American Indian, American Indians, American Presidents, and so forth and so on. Some phenomenal, great exhibitions like the Great Inca Road, and a number of concepts dealing with things. The treaty exhibition, Nation to Nation. There's some others. We did cookbooks, we did children's books, we did all kinds of stuff. And then Rick as well. Rick preceded me to the Smithsonian as a senior manager and was very much involved in a number of books. There's some of his work. And then our authors as well have all produced books. Carl Ben, who couldn't be with us here tonight, he actually did 3 essays for us, or chapters for us, in the book. Carl is currently, by the way, writing a history on the Royal Ontario Museum. So he's hard at work on that particular publication. And then Richard Merritt has published books particularly on the history, Indigenous history of Niagara. And then Ron Dell, who's not with us today, but then we have Ron Williamson and Martin Cooper, who did a wonderful chapter for us on the archaeology, the historic archaeology of the Niagara region. They published a number of books as well. So when we approach this project, these are the standards that we set. First of all, editorial content. We want real knowledge holders, scholars, participating in writing each of these chapters. And then looking for the artwork that'll help visually support the content. Photography, both historic and contemporary images come to play. And by the way, on the contemporary side, for us, it's very important to show that we're not just looking back 200 years or something, but there has been this legacy of Indigenous peoples in the Niagara region from 13,000 years ago up to the present time. Use of maps, and there's quite a few maps in the book, actually, more than I expected. And then these other components in terms of the production are also critical. I think if you're going to ask scholars and knowledge holders like this to put forward their best work, you should make sure the design is up to standards as well, up to professional standards, to make the product fully a high quality product. And then the print quality. The book, we're happy to let you know that the book is printed in Canada. So I think at this point I can turn it over to Rick to walk us through the book, and we'll take it from there. Rick? Green arrow, red arrow.
Good evening, everybody. I'm sorry if I might get a little off track. I'm still suffering from the fact that the Bills got cheated out of their chance to go to the Super Bowl. So I might get a little confused from time to time. So a landscape of nations. The concept is that we, as Indigenous people, derive our identity from the land in which we live. And the Niagara region has had many Indigenous nations born, living there, passing through there. So it really is quite a very interesting. The Niagara River is a great historic corridor. So many things happen, and that impinge upon all of us. And I was born in Buffalo. My mother's a Tuscarora from the Tuscarora Nation. My dad's a Mohawk from Six Nations. And I grew up like a ping pong ball, going back and forth between the two, crossing the river all of the time, and noticing as I went across a lot of times the great landscape, but I didn't realize its history. So after all of those years, and finally Tim says, let's write a book about this, I thought, well, geez, I don't know if there's enough history to fill a book. I was just kidding, because I know these guys. Yeah, each one of them could fill up 2 books themselves. So when we start looking at the matters, what is the history? History is a tough thing to unravel, to make sense of, and then reweave in words and images so that people like you can begin to comprehend the core essence of these stories. We're just kind of hitting highlights, though, as we go through this. So we've also kind of made sure that the book itself is a beautiful representation of the landscape. You'll see a lot of great photographs of there of the environment, a lot of historic objects, paintings, and Tim mentioned the maps. And we decided very early, even though we're very Haudenosaunee-centric, that we need to represent both Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee points of view as the story of the land. And so we have a few of our Anishinaabeg writers that have contributed here. We have one here with us tonight. And it's interesting, though, as we began to compare our stories, the similarities were also really quite profound. The philosophical concepts, how we relate to the land, things that happen on the land. And so all of a sudden, Anishinaabeg people seem less strange to me because we were cohabiting this space. Not all of them. There's still a few that are a little strange, but we'll get to that. So as you can see, quite a range of topics. This thing will keep you busy for a long time, going through and going back to over. But it has a little bit of everything. Of the history, the personalities, the events, some of the tragedies, the art, but also a lot of reflections about what it means to live and work in that region. So I think we'll start through it. So we were lucky to get permission to publish this photograph by Robert Griffin. If any of you are familiar with him, he's a great historic artist, recreating scenes of that. And this one just seemed perfect for us, to be some sense of what it must have been like for the indigenous people to stand at Niagara before the tourism, before all of the museums, before all of the landscaped parks. What was it like to do that? And as we mentioned, Tim and I both worked for the Smithsonian. We actually both worked for the Native American Center for the Living Arts over in Niagara Falls, and we've worked on a lot of projects together. But it's gotten to the point, I don't know about you, but just hearing his introduction, I got exhausted, thinking like, God, when is this guy going to slow down? So every time Tim calls, I keep thinking, I don't know if I want to answer that call because I don't want to write another book or do another exhibit or change the world anymore. And we've gotten great support from the parks themselves, and we have a few people here to share the ideas that took place as well. So the parks, Niagara Parks, the Niagara region, has become this shared space, not only with the Haudenosaunee on both sides of the river, but with the people coming there. And as you probably all know, it lived in fantasy. A lot of times there are a lot of fables, a lot of stories made up about the falls, and we've tried to plow through some of that and help you tell what the real story is. So then somehow we talked this guy, Rick Hale, into helping with us in our collaboration. So all of the chapters have a reference to the water, the river, coming out of the mist, crossing over the river, because to us that was the big theme that we take a look at. What are the origins of this? How did it first start? Now, as a Haudenosaunee person, we know we were connected to the neutral people, to the Huron people. It was similar cultures, similar language, similar lifestyle. So we have this kind of genetic connection to them. And so when we do find out about the archaeology and about the history, all of a sudden it's interesting to me. It helped to reinforce stories I heard when I was a young man about our connection to the people who first lived here. We didn't just move over here in 1784. We've been coming over here a lot to work with our relatives, sometimes to work against them, but every now and then even your relatives need a house tuning. And we tried to then bring in the art of the land. So we believe the world was created on the back of a turtle. A woman fell from the sky in this painting by Arnold Jacobs. The world was created there. A lot of things happened. And then eventually our people began to live in these long houses, long bark houses. And but they began to kind of feud with one another. And so one day this peacemaker and his helper Hiawatha, showed up with this idea of putting aside war to create peace, to create unity. So that's why we call ourselves Haudenosaunee, the people who build a long house. And boy, I think the archaeological record, Ron, if I remember right, maybe the longest one over in New York is about 450 feet long. So think about that. Think about if you were all my relatives and we're all living in the same house at the same time. And it's the middle of winter, and us old gray-haired people in the middle have to go to the bathroom. It's quite a challenge, to say the least. And so those first footprints on the land have been documented by the oral history of the people, our living memory, but also with our archaeological record. Now, when I was younger, I got to admit, I didn't like archaeologists very much. There was a big feud going on between us and them, particularly over human remains. So the first time I met Ron, I got to admit, I was a little leery. Ron, I know he's not so scary. It's just kind of like, how are we going to resolve these differences? But it turned out through time, I've gotten to know Ron and also realized that he is a collaborator with us on understanding our past. He's been respectful to take a look at these matters. He's not there to harm us through archaeology, but to advance our thinking about that. And the discoveries they've made reinforce in our mind the great creativity of our ancestors, their connection to that place, how people actually lived in these long houses as well. So we wanted to make sure that Ron talked about that, the first people on that land. What can we learn from that? So Ron, if you could come up here, are you going to both share this? Are we going to do both?
No, Harvey's going to do chapter 3.
Okay.
You'll do the neutral. I'll take that though. Evening. Well, thank you, Rick. And I want to begin by thanking Rick and Tim for the opportunity to have worked on this book. It's a beautiful book. And Marty and I and one of our other colleagues, Rob McDonald at ASI, worked together on the chapter on first footprints. A lot of the book is, or a lot of our chapter is about, the chapter is about the first 12,500 years before the first wisps of colonial presence on the continent. And it's hard to do that in 12 pages. So we do very much, obviously, focus on just a few highlights in Niagara, one of which is this map on the right, the Peace Bridge site. Peace Bridge, that portion of Fort Erie and the Peace Bridge Plaza and facilities are buried beneath that area is a town before the current town that had 2,000 or 3,000 years of occupation. And archaeologists that work with us, they can't believe how fortunate they are to work in that area, because if you sink a spade into the ground, for every basically square meter, you'll come up with 3,000 or 4,000 artifacts, literally. And that's because it's a chert quarry, but also people lived and fished there, and they buried their dead there. But I want to start 13,000 years ago with a very special site called the Mount Albion West site, which is on the Niagara Escarpment. We had a colleague from ROM here, Peter Stork, who's a curator emeritus, and Peter spent a great period of his career looking for sites of First Peoples along the Niagara Escarpment where there was a cut caused by a stream valley. And Red Hill Creek Valley, they decided, the city of Hamilton in their great wisdom, to put a big highway through the middle of that beautiful valley. And we were called to have a look at the archaeology of it, and we found a site that dated to 13,000 years ago. I was friends with Peter, and I called Peter Stork from ROM in to look at that, and lo and behold, we found tools that actually had elephant blood on them, meaning mastodon or mammoth. We couldn't tell from the DNA which was which, but this was one of the first times in all of northeastern North America that Proboscidean blood was found on a stone tool, and that tells us that they were killing and butchering these mega elephants, in addition to other resources like caribou. If you're wondering about the density of occupation over the Niagara area in the last 12,000 years, this gives you a pretty good image. And you'll note that it follows those corridors. It follows the escarpment. It follows the Niagara River and other rivers. And so those kind of lineal arrangements that you see is because people were using the landscape and following the landscape. In Fort Erie, right under the plaza, we found a lot of evidence of this particular kind of projectile point. You can see the size of it very easily. It looks like a pine tree. It dates to roughly 4,000 years ago, and we found several thousand of these points on this site at the Peace Bridge. But we also found a little bit later on, or we found features that date later on. So these are 2,800 years ago. And these are caches, like you've heard of medieval hoards where people bury things not to go back to them, and that's what these are. This is made of the chert that outcrops at Fort Erie, and these are beautiful caches that some of them people went back to and used and then recached them, but some of them, we can tell, they went back in the ground, or they went in the ground and they were never touched again. So we think about what that is about. Is it an offering in relation to the stone, which is so important to people's lives? But there are other amazing art objects that were found throughout Niagara. Here on the bottom right is a bird stone. These objects are only about like this long. ROM actually has the nicest collection of bird stones that I know of in the Northeast. But it was found right in a feature, and we wanted to show this because we wanted to be sure that people understand that even 2,000 years ago, people were creating exquisite art that rivals anywhere in the world at the same time. A blocked and stone 2 pipe we found at the site, and that's made of an Ohio limestone. So it's found on the Peace Bridge site, made of a stone that comes from Ohio. With time, maize is introduced, and you'll see here in the slide, maize is introduced into the New York area about 2,200 years ago. And it has a profound change on people's lives. People who were harvesting naturally occurring resources with various seasons and moving about the landscape, suddenly they could grow corn in one place, and therefore they could stay for a longer period of time. Populations grew. More people live together, and we start to get the kinds of longhouses that you're seeing here, and indeed the one that Rick referred to, over 400 feet long in New York State. At the Peace Bridge site, we found this pot, and you can see what it looked like on the left, and then we reconstructed it. The pot had collapsed inwards and left the last meal of the pot in the pot. And it was something called 10 fish soup, because there were 10 species of fish in the pot, along with a shoulder of venison, deer, and a pot herb, and the Niagara Indigenous Culinary Course. I called them up, and they decided that they would try to recreate that soup, and we served it to hundreds of people one night in Fort Erie in the late 90s. And I remember the woman who did it, and there were tears streaming down her cheek because here she was creating a 1,500-year-old meal and serving it to people. And her course had made this. By the time you get to the neutral period with the big, huge villages, they're also producing exquisite art in various forms. Martin's going to come up in a minute and talk about the neutral. And that's the neutral people who were absorbed by the Haudenosaunee. But just look at these 2 pipes and how absolutely stunningly beautiful they are. That upper one is a loon, obviously, with little insets of white shell and a blue turquoise glass bead that makes that eye. And finally, at the Peace Bridge site, we also found this Thunderbird Gorget, a one-of-a-kind artifact in the Northeast. Just beautiful. And the book also explores the meaning of Thunderbird in a number of very interesting ways that Tim writes about based on oral history. And finally, if you ever want to see any of this material, you can actually visit a choice selection of the artifacts that come from Niagara and from the Peace Bridge area at Mewinza, which is in the plaza, or which is in the atrium of the Peace Bridge Administration Building, and it's open most days. You could phone ahead and see it, but it's a gorgeous display that features contemporary and past Indigenous art.
All right, thank you, Ron. I've had some corn soup that tasted like it was made 12,000 years ago, but fortunately my wife is quite a great cook, as you can see, and enjoy that. I know sometimes looking at arrowheads can be a little snoozy, you know, because there's thousands of them, but think about that. Somebody had to make that in order to eat. Somebody had to find the right kind of stone. Somebody had to learn all of that. So I'm always amazed by the spectacular artistry involved in something as simple as making an arrowhead, but it has such beauty of craftsmanship. Next, you're going to talk about Ron?
Neutral Nation, yeah, so Marty's going to do that.
Okay, Marty's going to come up and join us. Tell us a little bit about the history of the neutral people. Is that right?
Yeah, that's
All
right.
right, good.
I didn't write this chapter. Ron Dale wrote it, but I helped with the archaeology chapter that Ron was just talking about. The neutral, when the Europeans arrived in Ontario in the early 17th century, Champlain was told about the neutral and that they were a large confederacy of tribes that lived in the Niagara Peninsula area, and he gave them the name neutral. They were made up of between 8 and 9 tribes. It's estimated that they had a population of over 30,000 people. The main bulk of the population lived in the Hamilton-Brantford area and then extended through the Niagara Peninsula to the Niagara River, and they even had villages on the other side of the Niagara River in what is now New York State. They were Iroquoian speaking, but we know very little about them. The only written records were visits made in 1626 by a Recollet missionary, and then in 1641 by 2 Jesuits visited the neutral. So we just have a little bit of knowledge about what they were like. We know that they grew corn, they were expert deer hunters, fishing was really important. And through archaeology, we have found out even more about them, and we've some of the villages have been excavated. I did a project in the southeastern Niagara Peninsula on a number of villages that were there. And one thing is, to give an idea of how little we know about them, we don't even know what they called themselves. Neutral was the name that Champlain gave them because he was told that they weren't at war with the Huron and they weren't at war with the Haudenosaunee. So he thought they were neutral, but in fact, they were carrying on a pretty intensive warfare with the Fire Nation that lived in southeastern Michigan and northeastern Ohio. So most of what we know about them is through archaeology. In the 1970s, the Royal Ontario Museum was involved in a major excavation at a neutral cemetery in the Grimsby area. And those pipes that Ron showed the slide were from Grimsby. After the excavation was done, the remains were all repatriated. And there was a huge political and legal battle over that excavation, which was done in the 70s. Things have changed a lot since then. And that's probably the archaeology that Rick was referring to as not being very friendly. Anyhow, that's a little bit about the neutral. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Can you imagine not fighting the Hurons, not fighting the Haudenosaunee? I would call them lucky, if you ask me. Right? So the Lucky Nation existed in these longhouses in this all the way through. I guess, how far are close to Toronto?
Oh, all around Toronto, up to the Oakridge Moraine and then beyond, because the Huron lived in Simcoe County.
Yeah, so there's really an amazing amount of history in there. Paul Williams had joined us. He's a lawyer at Six Nations, been involved in many important cases. In fact, just won a great victory in the Quebec court, where the Quebec court ruled that the covenant chain, the nature of our treaty relationship, is not only still valid, but it really is part of the Canadian Constitution. That case is being appealed, but it's going to be very interesting to see how it rolls out. So what Paul did is trace a little bit of our legal history, but really the history of treaty making. We believe that the first treaty made between us, the Anishinaabeg and the Huron and other people, was this wampum belt at the far side here. It's called the dish with one spoon. That nature provides all of this bounty, but we're meant to share it. We're all meant to sit around this dish and everybody takes their equal part. Well, the fur trade kind of turned that on its end, and we got involved in picking sides between the French and the English. But there was a grand treaty council at Fort Niagara in 1764. Sir William Johnson, who was the Indian agent at the time, he gathered together, I think it was 24 native nations. Now, it must have been kind of a feisty time because people were kind of still a little animosity about that. And you can still see that today because, among the Anishinaabe people, they dance in a certain direction. The Haudenosaunee, we dance in the other direction. When I asked my Anishinaabe friend, why is that? How come you guys dance backwards? He says, we don't dance backwards. He says, you guys are so uptight, you need to unwind. So I can appreciate that. So this is a replica of that wampum belt that was delivered at that time, made by Ken Maracle, to talk about where the covenant chain, with the founding principle of our treaty relationship with the Crown, was extended to the Western nations at a council that was then held at Fort George, where Tim and I are working on a project to recreate if you can imagine, a metal frame of what that council house looked like, and start having gatherings and meetings and performances in there, still at the Niagara-on-the-Lake. Like I said, history is a very, very complicated thing. And for the longest time, when I was younger, we're also fighting with historians. We didn't like the way they wrote about us, and they didn't collaborate with us. And at the same time, we had community oral history, and we had written history. And sometimes these things don't quite match up. So it finally took Richard Merritt and the work that he did to break me of my nasty habit of dislike of historians, so that we worked together on several projects here, and I got to appreciate the fact that his meticulousness of asking the hard questions, of exploring and pushing it further, helps us understand the nature of what took place. But Richard, if you could come up here and share some comments on your chapter, that'd be great.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rick. And first of all, I would like to take this opportunity again to thank Rick and Tim for inviting me to this, to be part of this project. And I also would like to take this opportunity to thank the ROM for putting this on today, because I've been a member of the ROM for 50 years. And my late wife, her uncle actually was the director of the ROM for 10 years. So our families feel very close to the ROM. So thank you for putting this on this evening. You've already really covered this particular instance. This was the Treaty of 1764, which was a response to the Pontiac Uprising. And so they met at Niagara, mostly on Fort Niagara side, which is on the now American side. But we do know they came over and treated with the Western nations on the Canadian side as well. And each warrior was given one of these medals. And it's really quite a nice, remarkable medal, which actually shows the chief on the left side and the British officer on the right are shaking hands. And with the left hand, the chief is handing over to the British officer peace pipe. And in the distance on the right, you can see a canoe, and on the horizon, you can see a tall ship of the British. So it's bringing together the two cultures. It's really quite a remarkable medal. This one is in the collection of the Riverbrink in Queenston. Okay, so I think that's all I'll say about that one. Okay, thank you.
We might have you back up.
Yeah.
Distribute several pieces.
But I just wanted to clarify the history. Did you say your wife was your aunt?
No.
Okay. I just want to make sure we understand. See, that's how wars start, right? Just a little bit of disinformation. Carl Ben was another historian who joined us, couldn't be here tonight. We're going to ask Jim if you could come up and talk a little bit about Carl's contribution to our volume.
I feel a lot representing Carl Benn, a brilliant historian who's worked here in Toronto for decades, still a professor. This is a little bit about the two-row wampum belt. And as the non-Indigenous hill here, there's a lot of hills up here. I'm the Canadian of the bunch. This project is very much like the two-row wampum, but it has two stories to it. This is one of the earliest belts, supposedly between Europeans and Indigenous people, between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee. And it's supposed to represent that we're going to travel on two paths together and not interfere with each other. But there might be another side of that story that Rick will talk a bit about now.
What we asked Carl to do is explore the history of this particular wampum belt and the treaty that it was said to be associated with. And there's a bit of controversy around that. There was a document that was reputed to be the written version in the Dutch treaty. Some people believe it was fraudulent, and so there's been a lot of discussion about when did the two-row actually start. We like to say it doesn't matter when, the fact that it started is the real important matter. And there have actually been many different versions of the two-row. So we did a kind of point-counterpoint. Carl said this is what the history, the written history, the documentary evidence shows us about the two-row. And then I provided the other side of what it means to us as the Haudenosaunee people, as our founding treaty. Two vessels, a canoe and a ship, going down the river of life together, tied together in partnership. So you're right, in many ways this was the metaphor for our work being doing here. How can we bring our minds together to tell a more complete story about what happened in our backyard? And Carl then also began to take a look at the American Revolution, the impact that it had here. Are you going to do part two?
Yeah, sure. Jim can do the next two chapters, this one and then the War of 1812.
It's tough working with Rick sometimes because we talk about very serious stuff and then you're laughing hysterically 2 minutes later. So there's a little country next door to our country right now. It's going to have its 250th birthday. Starting actually this year is the start of the American Revolution. And this is an event that really divides many people. So English-speaking North Americans, French people, and it divides the Haudenosaunee as well and other indigenous nations. So it's not just a founding event in American history, it's a founding event in Canadian history and really set the tone of that ongoing relationship between the Crown and indigenous people. We haven't always been very good allies, we've been horrible allies. But we have those treaties that didn't suddenly disappear in 1776 or in 1867 because we created a new institution or a new country. You've got the clicker.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. And this is some of the points that come up on the cause of the American Revolution. You're going to hear a lot about tea in the next couple of years. But it has a lot more to do with literally tens of millions of acres of land. And I'd even go so far as to say the other horrible institution going on at that time, and the institution of slavery. So you'll learn more about that probably in the coming years. But that's an example of the Royal Proclamation that basically said in 1763, if you want to deal with land, you have to deal with all indigenous people, all of their political leadership. You just can't arbitrarily send some kid named George out into the wilderness and stake off land and say it's yours. And of course, this leads to round two. This is The Empire Strikes Back, maybe, the War of 1812. And this is an incredibly important story we tell in Niagara. It's important here in Toronto as well. And the role of Indigenous people in the War of 1812 are absolutely critical. If you're proud to be Canadian and you like living here, you would not be in Canada today if not for the contribution of Indigenous people. And it's a line that I use probably too much, and these guys have heard it many times. But at the Battle of Queenston Heights, there's a warrior, a leader there named John Norton, or Tainenho Garrowan. And at the height of that battle, a fellow named Isaac Brock has been killed. He's not just the British commander in the province, he's also the lieutenant governor or the administrator of the province. He's been killed. And John Norton and his warriors are running to the battle, and they run into Canadians who are running away in the wrong direction. And they say to him, the general's dead, the Yankees hold the heights. If anybody should turn around and run away, it should be you guys, because American proclamations had threatened they would not take any native warriors prisoner. And an older warrior steps up, according to John Norton, and says, the more game, the better the hunting. And for about 4 hours, they're the only people defending Canada. Until the Canadians and British guys turned around, to our credit, and came back and helped them. So if you're proud to live in this country, you owe a great debt to Indigenous people, and there's a picture of Mr. Norton there.
And to make up for that debt, you just need to buy the book. Okay, so thank you very much. So we got another chapter by Richard, if you could share.
So also I was asked to write a chapter on the council house. There actually were two types of council house. And you've heard Rick Hill's already talked to you about the traditional council house that developed in what is now upstate New York amongst the Haudenosaunee. And that there actually are still council houses on the reserve at Six Nations, correct? Yeah, who carry on the traditional practices. So that is the traditional council house. Sir William Johnson was a young Irishman who arrived in what is now upstate New York in 1738, and he quickly became enamored by the surrounding Six Nations people. He was enamored by their customs and their traditions and their languages, and he studied their council houses. And so when he was officially appointed Superintendent of Indian Affairs a little later, he developed a council house, which would be a meeting house between the British officers and the Indigenous allies to polish, metaphorically, that covenant chain of friendship that you heard about earlier. And so at these council houses, they would be established at outside each of the forts, and also beside his house, which was Johnson Hall. And he, at these council houses, they would discuss treaties, they would discuss grievances, they would get their king's bounty for the year, and they might get interest payments if they were owed interest payments. And these would be held whenever either side wanted to call a council. So these were the British Indian Department's council houses. So after the after the American Revolutionary War and the Fort Niagara was given up to the Americans, they had to establish an Indian council house on the Canadian side, and that it was established right in the middle of the Commons. Now, for those of you who know Niagara-on-the-Lake, as you approach Niagara-on-the-Lake from the Parkway, and the Shaw Festival is on your left-hand side. That huge open field is known today as the Commons, but it was the Fort George Military Reserve, and in the midst of that was the Indian Council House, it was a very important spot for 20 years up to the War of 1812, because it was, in fact, some people would say it was a more important site than the adjacent Fort George, because that's where it was that the British were keeping the Indigenous allies on side. So that was the British Indian Department's council house. And eventually, after the War of 1812, it was destroyed by the Americans, of course, when they withdrew from Niagara. And eventually, the Indian Council House was moved to Toronto, and then later on was discontinued. But that's the other type of council house.
Thank you. This is a painting of where the council house was the center part of that was later turned into a military hospital. So Richard's got one more to talk a little bit about the Brock's Monument and what happened there around the commemoration, or the building and the commemoration of it.
About 20 minutes, so guys keep moving quickly.
Yeah, okay. So just the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Queenston Heights, you can imagine, was a very important event. And so thousands assembled on the 100th anniversary, and they did invite Indigenous people to come to that, because of course they were involved in the Battle of Queenston Heights. And at that time, some of the Indigenous leaders came forward and they said, why is there no recognition of the Indigenous allies and their importance in this battle? Here we have this huge monument to Brock, who was killed shortly after the battle was started, and yet there's no recognition of the Indigenous peoples. And the people who were there, they said, yeah, that's true. We should be doing something. But it was just, this is 1912, just before the First World War, and so everything was forgotten, and so nothing happened for another 100 years.
My great-grandfather was a Tuscarora chief. His name was Richard Hill, the guy that I'm named after. He was one of the chiefs at that commemoration in 1912. I returned in 2012 to deliver a speech. That's how I got to know Jim and some of the others there. So it's kind of amazing. The only real problem with that is I basically had to deliver the same speech that my great-grandfather delivered. Is, when are you going to live up to your treaty obligations? But now you get a chance to do that by having to buy 2 books. I'd like to invite Josh up here. Josh, a Anishinaabeg scholar who's trying to reconcile between them and us. He married a Seneca woman. I don't know how that's going, but Josh, we appreciate the attempt anyways to bring some marital bliss to our relationship.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Rick and Tim for inviting me to be part of this project, and I'm very happy to be here tonight. So the piece that I wrote about, when I think of Niagara Falls, it reminds me of the story I've heard of when the Anishinaabe migration story happened, when the Anishinaabe were coming into the Great Lakes. We met the Haudenosaunee people at Niagara Falls, and it is said that is the first time that we had the relationship through wampum, that first meeting that took place between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. But another story that I always used to hear about the falls is that it was home to the Thunderbirds long ago. And when I was asked to be part of this project, it just reminded me of an experience I had as a young boy, that my parents were driving this elderly man home one Sunday afternoon, and he invited us in his home to visit for the afternoon. And he told us a story of when he was a boy that he witnessed. So the job of the Thunderbirds is to go around and kill these serpents, these snakes, these water spirits. And he was telling us that when he was a boy, because he lived right overlooking the huge bay up on Manitoulin over the large water, and the serpent had come out of the water, and the Thunderbird had it striked him. So the lightning had killed the Thunderbird. So the Thunderbird had killed the serpent. So that was the story that I wanted to write about, and that's the short piece that I did in the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. We also asked another Anishinaabeg scholar, Alan Corbier, to write a little bit about some of the Anishinaabeg connections to the falls and some of the people that had a connection to this place. So we learned a lot about our own history through doing this work, and so we appreciate both what Josh and Alan provided. And because of this shared history, it's interesting now we're trying to reunite among the Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee people. Have to get past some of that harsh history and get back to that dish with one spoon idea. We also asked Mississauga, a historian, to provide a perspective, again, from there being the closest Anishinaabe community to in the Niagara region, about their history and what the place means. So we tried to look at a diversity of voices of helping to explain what the Niagara region means to us. Richard did a final piece here on some of the historic architecture in the Niagara region that he will share with us quite briefly.
Yeah. Many of you probably know that Niagara Lake and Queenston have a wonderful collection of post-war 1812 heritage homes. And amongst those homes, many of them, interestingly, were from families that were actually had Indigenous women who were the chatelaines of these homes, which is amazing. And also, there are early recordings of social events which American visitors would come to. This is in the just before the War of 1812, and they were amazed how integrated the people attending these dances were. That many of them were Indigenous women. So that was really tells you the story of the integration that was going on in Niagara Lake at a very early time.
One more, I'll just keep on going.
Okay. This just goes through the Niagara Lake was an army camp for all the militia for Military District Number 2, which included Toronto, by the way, all the Golden Horseshoe. And so they would send their militiamen for training at Niagara Camp, Niagara Lake. And amongst those were militiamen from Haldimand County, which includes part of Six Nations. And so amongst those Six Nations boys were men from Six Nations who trained at Niagara Camp and then went on to fight in the First World War, and of course some of them didn't come home. So they have quite a tradition amongst them too.
Sorry to be rushing through this, but I promised my girls I'd be home to watch a lacrosse game tonight, so I got to wrap this up pretty quick. Tim, when we worked together at the Native American Center in Niagara Falls, we wanted to tell what is the real story of the Maid of the Mist. There was this commercialized story. We found one old Seneca guy. We went out and interviewed them. So Tim recapped that story here. Are you going to? All right. So what he's saying is, if you want to know the story, you got to buy the book. This is the man here. His name is Corbett Sundown. He was really quite a knowledge carrier in his time. He held this old story all of these years. He was a little reluctant to share it, but he finally did. And then we wanted to profile some of the people tied to the region. We tell a lot of little mini profiles about both historic figures and contemporary figures. As an example, like my father, Stan Hill. Yeah, he was an iron worker, but he was famous for actually taking down the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge, the old Lewiston-Queenston Bridge. And that was quite a challenge in itself. Haudenosaunee ironworkers involved in building the Rainbow Bridge, the Peace Bridge, the new Lewiston-Queenston Bridge. And so we tried to honor that. I guess this cuts to.
No, just keep rolling, Jim. This is your side.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot what I wrote about. Also, selling beadwork was an important part of that as a result of siding with the Americans in the War of 1812. The man who ended up owning the property around the falls gave the right for Senecas and Tuscarora women to go down there and sell beadwork. And we really, it's an amazing explosion of beadwork that took place down by Niagara Falls. Many museum collections have it. I dare say some of you probably have these heirlooms in your own personal collection, which we would welcome to be recovered because of the debt that you owe us. So also crossing the border. Those of us who are indigenous, sometimes we can have a real difficult time crossing back over the border, back and forth. When they ask, who are you? When you say Haudenosaunee, they just look at you funny, like they don't know what that means. But there is an increasing recognition of that fact, that not only do we have a treaty right, we have this history of this connection. So this was original, it wasn't a protest, but it was a day in which the free border crossing right was celebrated. And we do that every year. So we're going to ask Travis, are you going to do this? Travis and Jim. Yeah, Travis is my third cousin from my second marriage, so I appreciate him taking the time to come here tonight.
Sego Ani, I'm Travis Hill, and much like Rick's lineage, my father is Mohawk and my mother's Tuscarora. So yeah, we're related somehow through some way. And I'll just share a quick story about why I'm in this book, which I still ask why. I was thinking about on my way up here, I was like, everything these guys have written on that are sitting on this stage, I've read to accumulate my knowledge. My background is in the War of 1812, and I shared what knowledge I learned from the people on this stage and shared it with the public. And throughout the process of elimination, Jim was forced to make me the manager of a War of 1812 site because I was the only one pretty much left standing. So I ended up my career with the Niagara Parks as the site manager of Old Fort Erie, which was talked a lot about. And I read all their archaeological books, Martin Cooper and Ron Williamson, to begin my journey of accumulating this knowledge. And then I talked about Indigenous involvement in the War of 1812 by giving tours. And yeah, I ended my time with the Niagara Parks Commission as the site manager. Currently, I'm the curator of Indigenous culture and heritage with the City of Hamilton. And I would just share a little less known fact about the Indigenous involvement, more particularly the Haudenosaunee during the War of 1812. A lot of people may not know, but the Confederacy was split prior to the war. As you probably know, there were 6 nations that made up the Haudenosaunee, or the Six Nations Confederacy. 3 resided on the U.S. side, 3 resided on the British territory, or on this side of the river. Throughout the war, the ones on the American side tried to remain neutral. And this is a quote from Jim. When you're trying to remain neutral and there's a war going on in your backyard, you have to worry about 2 teams coming through your village to burn it down. So at some point, you do have to choose a side. So in the final year of the War of 1812 and 1814, the ones on the American side decided to join up and fight alongside the Americans. And in particular, at the Battle of Chippewa in 1814, they were pitted against each other during that battle. And it was after that battle that they both decided on both sides of the river to basically put down their guns and their tomahawks and stay out of the war, and realize that they're killing off each other. So both sides remained neutral for the duration of that war. And this cycles back to the three nations that actually fought alongside the Americans were the Tuscarora, the Oneidas, and the Senecas. And the other 3 fought with the British. And as I mentioned, my family lineage is much like Rick's. My mother was Tuscarora, my father was Mohawk. So I relate my parents getting together to the War of 1812, that I'm thankful that they made peace with one another, so that I could be here today sharing this story with you. I don't know if Jim wants to add anything. I just wanted to share a quick story about the War of 1812 involvement, and me typically rambling on.
Travis spent 21 years with us. He started when he was 4 years old. That's why he looks so great. And I won't say any bad things about the city of Hamilton up here, but I will afterwards, if you'd like me to. This is my opportunity to remind you to come visit us in Niagara. This is this amazing stretch of water and all along there are a number of spots that tell spectacular stories of people who've been on that land for millennia, but also the importance of the relationship between Canadians, Americans, and our Indigenous neighbors. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And then, so that map was the Indigenous locations of history along the Niagara River corridor, all part of the Niagara Parks lands. Battle of Chippewa site. So we have these double-page cinematic spreads throughout the book, which is just absolutely stunning. And then here, I wanted to bring up Alex Hibachel, who was the original photographer for the Landscape of Nations Memorial, both the architectural photography and then when the unveiling took place, captured the opening ceremony. So, and again, coming back to you look at the transformational changes in the Niagara region, much of it stems from the establishment of this public artwork. So it's very interesting what public art can do in activating and motivating people to look at a history that they haven't really looked at before. We've got very little time.
Yes. Thank you very much, Tim. I want to thank you, Tim, of course, for calling me up on many occasions. Of course, here for the inauguration of the Landscape of Nations. And I just thought I'd share some very brief thoughts on my small participation in the book and some of the thought process behind that as a photographer. Part of my duty, I think of myself as just being able to provide those visuals with authenticity and to be genuine and sincere in those representations. That's a very important thing. One day, of course, you see in some of the book, you'll notice a lot of historic photographs. And the photographs that we create nowadays will one day be those historic photographs. So it's a matter of frame of mind. And they one day may become those artifacts when 100, 200 years from now, the story continues. The story of Turtle Island and the people on Turtle Island has been here for hundreds, even thousands of years. So it's very, very important to continue that. And of course, with today's tools, photography being one of them. So here, it was also my duty to show off the skill and craftsmanship of the amazing work and the design of the Landscape of Nations. Of course, here we have the two statues that you'll see at the entrance of Norton and Brant, and the wonderful craftsmanship in those. So that was one of my duties. Off to the side, you'll see we have the happenings and proceedings. So when an event happens, we don't always have a record of that as far as a physical, tangible item as an artifact, but if we create photographs, we have an artifact of happenings. And that is one of my duties, is to observe impartially to record that. And again, thank you very much for coming out tonight, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I think it's really interesting what you said, that today's photographs will become the historic photographs in the future. Certainly these images of the Landscape of Nations Memorial and everything associated with it will carry that forward. So I'm going to wrap it up fairly quickly here now. Again, we wanted to go full arc on this, from the ancient inhabitation of indigenous peoples in Niagara right through contemporary expressions. Jennifer Dockstader, who was a long-time executive director at the Fort Erie Native Friendship Center, did a beautiful chapter for us. And if you read through all of those historical essays and then you read hers, you see how it all ties together, how that history is still reflected in her own sense of identity. It's amazing. And then Vince Schiffert from Tuscarora on the other side of the river did a piece for us on the Tuscarora history. Did a great job. And then we ended the book with this conversation between Rick and Carl Dockstader, very talented guy who's been very active in the Indigenous community, particularly in the Niagara and the Lake area, but also in Fort Erie, actually, come to think of it. Extremely talented guy, you know, real disgusting type of guy, you know. He's just so talented. And so he also does a weekly radio broadcast where he covers contemporary Indigenous issues. Right? It's carried throughout the Niagara region area. But he's also a phenomenal artist. And so the last chapter belongs to Carl here, where we're featuring his digital artwork. And we end with this image that he did, his interpretation of the Maid of the Mist, right? So we kind of take the book full circle and bring it home with a contemporary expression of this deep history. And then even though the book was developed as what we would call a general interest reader, you know, lots of visuals, lots of images, a lot of exciting things to look at, it's still loaded with content. So our index is 9 pages long, for example. So not just the body text, but also the captions contain information, a lot of information as well. And then Santee, I did these photographs of the front and back covers. So she was doing this first, then she turned around, and there we had it. We had both the front cover and the back cover of the book. So really, really amazing when you're working on these projects. What happens organically sometimes is a lot of what makes the book and what makes products and projects like this really important. And when you can exceed your expectations, that's a great thing. So that's it. We're done with the presentation. Do we have time for Q&A? Skip Q&A, it says, right on that phone. But we're going to be able to sign books for people. If you have any questions, just come talk to us in the side room over here. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim, Rick, and all our speakers tonight. Thanks all of you for coming out tonight. As Tim said, we have the books back there. We have some people who could sign the books. We also have a reception for you. So please join us, stick around, and thanks again for coming tonight. And thank you again for all our speakers.